Right now we have with us Maya MacGuineas. She's president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which is one of the most important institutions you need to know about if you don't, about in Washington, that covers and researches budget and fiscal issues. It's a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. It has folks on it who come from both sides of the aisle, and Maya is one of the best analysts and one of the best analysts in town in putting budget and debt and deficit issues in the big picture, long-term perspective. So I was looking to hear from her about that. We have her until, it's 2 o'clock right now. We have her until 2:50, and so she's going to present, and then we'll have time for questions. And Maya, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Really nice to be with all of you. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk through a slideshow, like a couple of slides, a little bit just to give you guys an overview on fiscal issues. I'm going to then talk a little bit about what's going on, because there's just so much in the news right now on budget issues. But most of this will be Q&A. And so any questions you have. Oh, and I think I'll also show you, hopefully I'll be able to share my screens and do this too. I didn't prepare this, but we just created a whole bunch of new online budget simulations tools, which I think are almost fun, kind of fun if you like the budget, but definitely educational. And the purpose of them is to kind of attract other people who are not just glued to their spreadsheets into the world of budgeting. And so they're neat. I'll show you them as well. Before I jump in, are there any things in particular that people want to talk about? Fiscal policy, budget, tax, what's in the news, debt ceiling, anything people want to talk about? Okay. I love to be interrupted. It makes me feel like people are interested in paying attention. So please don't even put something in the chat. If there's something you want to say while I'm talking, just unmute and jump right in. Basically, I'm just going to go over some budget numbers. But if you are covering the budget or you're doing any story that's related to the budget, the place you always want to start is the Congressional Budget Office. And just by ways of like how much I love the Congressional Budget Office, I'll take you 2 seconds and just tell you about, like, more than 2 seconds, 2 minutes, tell you about how I got into this. But my first job was as a research assistant at the Brookings Institution, and that was a great job, learned so much. My second job was working on Wall Street. I wanted to kind of take research and apply it into the private sector. Didn't love that so much, to each their own. Like, it was just a helpful thing in what I didn't actually enjoy doing. But while I was there, I read a report from the Congressional Budget Office, just their basic report that they put out a couple times a year, the outlook, the economic and budgetary outlook. And it like rocked my world. I don't know why. I don't know why I was so taken with it. I'm a political independent. And one of the things I loved about it is that it was so clear to understand. Like, it wasn't, I find a lot of times that in DC, people use language in ways to alienate people and make it impossible to read. Like, I can't read legislative language to save my life. But I found the Congressional Budget Office report so easy to understand and so non-political in the lens they used, which was really refreshing for me. And despite being a native Washingtonian, I don't like politics. I don't think it's particularly good for the country. And I really like the policy stuff. So it sucked me in. And so basically CBO changed the course of my career. I went back to graduate school, studied all of these issues, and have been doing them ever since. Also, I will just say about the organization, because you can see I was so excited to talk about the numbers, I jumped right in. But the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which, thank you, Chris, for the nice compliments. It also is an organization which has like the world's worst title. No one can even remember the name, including our board members. But the thing that's really neat about it, I think, beyond being bipartisan, and we really, really are, we have a staff that's made up of everybody across the aisle, across the spectrum, both sides of the aisle. But our board are people who've worked in Washington in the leading position. So the former heads of Treasury, the Fed, the budget committees, OMB, CBO. So it's really who's who of budgeting world. And what that does, besides help us in terms of just basic credibility, is it gives them a real understanding of what's possible and what's not in the political environment. So they're very good at helping us as an advocacy group think about, like, okay, you always want to be figuring out how to pay for things, not add to the debt, but politically that's very challenging. So they give us a really helpful perspective on, like, strategically how much to push on things, might be some smart approaches to things. So that's one of the reasons I kind of love working at this group, and it stayed interesting for so long. Okay, so now jumping into the numbers, I do just want to start with where the money comes from, where it goes. It's probably quite basic. Many of you probably know this, but in the budget world, there's a ton of questions that people don't know the answers to, but are like almost too embarrassed to ask because you feel like you should know them. So just quickly going through this, the budget, $6.8 trillion in this year, highly, highly unusual year because we still have COVID spending going out the door. The budget is basically in the neighborhood of 5.5 trillion on a more normalized basis. We'll get back there next year. Fingers crossed, COVID improvements materializing as we all hope they will be. And what's important to know is that 2/3 of that budget goes to mandatory spending. Those are the programs that are automatic pilot, don't go through the appropriations process. They're basically if-then statements. If you paid into Social Security and are over the retirement age, you qualify for benefits. If you are a farmer who has a particular, sugar crop that qualifies, you get insurance. If you are a government employee, you get paid. So there are a whole lot of programs in there. The bulk of them are retirement and healthcare, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, by far the biggest, but there's a lot of other programs that are in there. Government pensions, in addition to some of the other things that I already mentioned. Now, most of the press coverage is all about the other third, the appropriations. And we're about to be in a coverage month because this is the last month before the fiscal year ends at the end of September. This is where if they don't pass these appropriations or a continuing resolution, the government will have a shutdown. It's divided about equally into defense spending and non-defense spending. And it's disproportionate. This is the area of the budget that gets so much more attention and coverage, but it's not the biggest part of the budget. And a lot of times, I think because of the way that Congress is set up, lawmakers actually act like they don't oversee these mandatory programs since they'll keep getting paid if they do nothing. But of course, we'll talk about this in a second, but Social Security and Medicare are on the trajectory towards insolvency. Like they actually should be doing things to help oversee these programs, but because they don't go through that annual appropriations process, they don't get nearly as much attention. But the vast majority of our budget is mandatory. The majority of that is healthcare and retirement. And it actually relates to one of the statistics I find the most stunning in the world of fiscal policy, which is in the federal budget. We spend $6 per seniors on every one we spend on people under 18. So a lot of times, like presidents will run and they'll spend most of their time talking about education, the importance of that. Education is a tiny fraction of the federal budget. So these pie charts, I think, are just useful to keep in mind what the budget is and where the money comes from. So on the tax side, the 3.8 trillion is more similar to what we'll see in future years too. It'll go up to about 4.5 trillion next year. The budget deficits will be about $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion going forward. They're much bigger in the 2 COVID years. That's to be expected. You want to be borrowing during an emergency like COVID. That's exactly what you should be doing. The issue is that you keep borrowing once the economy has recovered. That's not what you should be doing. And again, I'll go into that in a couple minutes. But the biggest tax is the individual tax, over half of the budget, slightly over. But the biggest tax paid by most households is actually the payroll tax. That's the tax that goes to finance Social Security and Medicare. Corporate tax has been shrinking in terms of its overall size, predominantly because of globalization. It's much harder to tax capital. And so it's been really hard to sustain that as a big base. The payroll tax and the corporate tax actually flipped in terms of the share of revenues that they provide over the past decades. Other taxes like the estate tax, excise tax. This shows us where our deficits are headed. And there's obviously 2 huge outlier years. This chart has changed massively since the world of COVID, but the budget deficits are growing every year. These are structural issues. We have many programs that were not fully paid for when they were put in. We have Social Security and Medicare, which are growing faster than the revenues support them because people are living longer and healthcare costs are growing faster than the economy. We have interest payments, which because our debt is constantly growing, those interest payments are projected to be growing over the coming years. And so you can see the deficit is projected to grow. Current law is what's in law. Current policy is, there are a lot of fake expirations in the law. So when the tax cuts were passed in 2017, they were slated to expire to make the overall cost of the package look smaller. Many of those will in all likelihood be extended, because once something's in the budget, whether it's on the tax side or the spending side, it's very difficult to get rid of. So I don't think they'll all be extended, but I think most of them will be. So current policy is if you get rid of the fake expirations, which were never intended to really be there, and you look at the cost of this. So you can see deficits rising steadily. That leads into the debt. Everybody knows, I'm sure, but the deficit is the difference each year between what you spend and what you take in. The debt is basically the accumulation of those deficits. We are now at a point where we are near record levels of debt. The only time it's been higher is right after World War II, more understandably because it came from having fought a world war. The debt right now is more a result of basically just not caring to pay for things during economic good times. Like I said, bad times, COVID, 2008, 2009, you should be borrowing without restraint. You should be, borrow smart, borrow for the right things, but you should borrow as much as you need to help the emergency and the economy. But then you should bring back that debt trajectory back down during the times of economic growth. We don't do that. As a result, our debt has grown really to levels never seen, not following a war before, and it's projected to grow much more. If we do nothing over the next decade, if we don't pass any of the bills that are currently being discussed, we will borrow another $13 trillion over the next decade. So debt is growing many times faster than the economy. Now, here's another sort of cause for concern that should have warning lights for our lawmakers, but again, because these are mandatory programs and they also just don't like doing hard things, this can has been kicked for many, many years. But we have a number of trust funds that are headed towards insolvency. The most notable ones are the ones that the trustees, Social Security and Medicare trustees, they're really interesting reports they put out every year, the annual reports of those programs. But they warn every year, these programs are headed towards insolvency. The longer we wait to make changes, the more expensive they're going to be. They're going to fall on a smaller group of people because the baby boomers, this huge generation, is moving into retirement. But as you can see, Medicare, 5 more years till the hospital insurance trust fund becomes insolvent. Social Security, when today's 54-year-old was retiring, we're going to have the program will be insolvent then. And just as an aside, like, it's insane that we're waiting to the last minute to shore these programs up. There's a whole lot of different ways that you can fix them. I would fully expect that members of Congress and the public would fight vehemently about what ways we should fix them, but doing nothing should not have been an option for the past years. We should have made these changes already. And back to those tools I have, we have one called the Social Security Reformer, which is how you can make your own Social Security reform plan. There's not even that many options. It's like on the spending side, across the board spending cuts, or slowing the growth of benefits for people who need them less to preserve them for people who need them more. There's talking about raising the retirement age. There's raising revenues, either that payroll tax that supports it, the cap that would be more progressive, the rate, which would be across the board, or putting some other revenues into the system. Changing the way we calculate inflation is another option. That's it. Those are kinds of the options. And the Social Security Reformer tool is so good, I think, that a couple members of Congress have actually used it to come up with their own Social Security reform plans, and then brought it to the trustees to get them actually scored. But it's really good because it helps get rid of kind of the myths out there of, actually, as I'm saying this, I'm hoping that tool's updated. I think it is. It may be 1 year. I'm not sure if we've updated it yet for the trustees, but it helps you find out, like, how much would you save of the whole gap if you raise the retirement age? How much would the payroll tax have to go up? So it's the educational piece to all these tools is pretty good, I think. Just want to focus on net interest because it's such a powerful kind of visualization of what we're doing. You hear a lot of people talking about, don't worry about the debt. Interest rates are really low. We can borrow and there's no problem. Like, first, trust me, we are borrowing. We are borrowing that 13 trillion we're going to borrow over the next decade. That is fully taking advantage of low interest rates. And it was put in place, much of it, before they were even there. So we're already using that fiscal space. But the other thing is, even with low interest rates, interest payments are going to triple over the next decade, from about $300 billion to about $900 billion. Give or take. No one can project interest rates, but this is the Congressional Budget Office best guess. And we rely on CBO for almost everything because of the enhanced credibility. I never kind of want to put our own projections out there if they already exist, for fear that somebody sort of looks at why you made the different assumptions you did and think that it has some bias in it. So CBO's projections are, good. Interest rates will go up somewhat, but not as much as they have gone up in the past. So those interest payments are a big issue. And then this is just, and this is my last slide before we talk a little bit more, but this is just, who cares, right? Part of my job is to get people to care about this issue. And if you look at how massively the debt has been growing, I'm not doing a particularly good job. And one of the reasons is, beyond just the massive political pressure that there is not to pay for things, it's really hard for voters to see how this connects to their lives. Voters are going to understand good schools, saving for college, retirement, secure jobs, healthcare costs, taxes, all of those things. But it is very hard to see that actually the fiscal health of the country affects every one of those issues and many more. So some of the consequences of having a debt that's too high is that it does slow the growth of the economy. That can happen from crowding out, even with very low interest rates. And what that means when your debt is too high, which all the experts would argue it is in terms of the economic effects, slower economic growth leads to lower standard of living. And that means that today, in fact, our salaries are lower because of the borrowing of the past decades than they would otherwise be. But you never realize what you could have had. So one of the reasons it's hard to get people as upset about this, I guess they haven't all read those great CBO reports, is basically because you don't realize that you would be richer today, overall, at least as the economy would be richer, if we hadn't borrowed, particularly because we borrowed so much for consumption and so little for investment in all those past years. Now, the thing is the effects on the federal budget, like I talked about interest payments, don't care if you're a huge Republican who loves tax cuts, huge Democrat who loves spending increases, something else. If you're spending that money on interest payments, it's not going to the rest of the budget pie. And so it shrinks what resources are available. Basically, it's the payments that we're making for having borrowed in the past instead of being able to spend it today. And that decision was somebody else making that for people today. Also worth noting that interest to borrow for the deficit, we borrow about 40% of that from overseas, abroad. China and Japan are tied for number one of who owns the US debt outside of the US. You will note that that is not necessarily consistent with our economic relationship with China right now. It is a vulnerability that it leaves us with because they have $1 trillion of treasuries. So while we're having trade wars and other tensions about missiles, they have $1 trillion of debt that they could decide to sell or not come to our treasury auctions. That has a real effect. So there's the budgetary effects. There's the true importance of having the ability to borrow when you need to. And that's in emergencies and recessions and wars. And since we borrow all the time, we don't know at what point there will be real pressure from the bond market that makes borrowing more expensive during the next COVID or cyber attack or recession, financial market crisis, whatever it is. If we're unable to borrow and maintain low interest rates at the time, that makes coming out of that economic downturn much, much more difficult. We have no idea at what point we would reach that. It depends on other alternatives around the world and how people feel about lending at the time. But it is just plain stupid for us to kind of barrel towards this tipping point and find out where it is instead of getting our fiscal situation back into a safer zone. I think another reason it really matters is we have so much tied our own hand from borrowing in the past that it leaves our budget not as flexible as it should be. And I think that's more important now than ever. And there's so many things you could point to, but clearly the world of national security is changing, where what we really need is to be developing a massive cyber defense system. But we're not talking about huge shifts in national security in that our budget is sort of ossified and going to the same things it used to be. In many ways, we're financing defenses against the old threats, not the new ones. I think an even better example is the social contract. We have a social contract that was made for last century's challenges, which was being a senior. After the Great Depression, seniors were the poorest group in the country, and they lived in massive poverty. Big programs were created, help in retirement and healthcare, that brought them from being the group with the highest poverty rate to the group with the lowest poverty rate, which is where they are now. Unfortunately, as that's turned on its head, the group with the highest poverty rate now is children under 18. And so you want to look at how your resources are being deployed. That $6 to 1 is kind of a statement of values that I'm not sure is what people would say makes sense right now, but it also misses many things in the social contract that are new needs. I guess the example I would give would be lifelong learning. It used to be that you finish school, you're 18, you're 22, you're 26, you know what you're going to need to know for your career path. That couldn't be farther from the truth now. And everybody's going to need to have access to ongoing education and training in a way that didn't used to be true. And yet our budget is so constrained from prior commitments. Those Social Security and Medicare commitments have already been made. So there's very little flexibility and interest, that we then don't have enough resources to really think about our budget, to create a budget that's appropriate for the threats, challenges, and opportunities of the moment. Generational unfairness. So it was in my 20s when I got into this issue, and I remember I was helping to start a group that get young people who cared about the debt. That group had so few members. I remember going to testify for Congress, and some senator just making fun of me, like when he asked how many members we had, and I was like, a couple. And he's like, yeah, come back to me when you're as big as the AARP is. So we know that the influence of seniors versus younger people is hugely disproportionate in the federal budget. And it shows, because you have a lot of people borrowing a lot of money and giving it to the next generation to make good on. And I got 2 high schoolers, and I give them speeches on this every night at the dinner table. And as you can imagine, they now try not to be home for dinner anymore because they are bored out of their minds on this topic. But it is an outrage. The whole sort of part of the economic, or the promise of America, is you leave an economy that's stronger for the next generation from the one you inherited. And that has finally changed. That is not happening anymore. The standard of living will not be growing the way it used to. And in fact, there will be all these new threats and challenges too. Ultimately, if this doesn't shift, there will be some kind of crisis. It won't be a default because we borrow in our own currency, but it certainly will be interest rates that go up, or quite likely a huge shift in the role that the dollar plays in the global economy. Well, we're the reserve currency right now, but that's not at all clear that that is something that we will maintain. So that is my presentation. Those are the numbers. I'm going to stop there and see who has comments, questions, thoughts, anything. And then we can talk more about what's going on right now or anything else. The other Maya, jump in.
Hi, Maya. I'm interested in.
Tell me where you're from and tell me a little bit about each person also.
Yeah, so I'm a reporter at Politico covering campaigns and national politics. And so your point about what voters care about and how voters are receiving this information is interesting to me, specifically on the tax point, because I feel like both sides on the campaign trail, you hear a lot about where your tax dollars are going, where you're spending your tax dollars. And I suppose I have a 2-part question. One, in your view, if that's even an effective messaging, because it's kind of hard to conceptualize, I think, where your tax dollars are going on a national level. And if that's flawed to you, what a better way of, I guess, explaining where people's tax dollars are going could be, thinking about the bar graph that you showed us early on, I guess, as an example. That was really easy for me to understand spending. And I wonder if there's a similar model that could be put in place for voters to understand just, where their money is going.
So it's really interesting because the budget actually used to do that, where it had didn't call it the budget for dummies, but it was something like that, where it was all a visual depiction of all of those different things. And it goes to that point that I was saying of everybody's too embarrassed to ask the basic questions on the budget because you feel like you should know them. But that was really popular. It's actually one of the things that sucked me in back then too, when I read the full budgets. I don't know. First off, people don't care about these issues very much in terms of the meta issue, like how much are we borrowing? How does it affect the economy? Basically, we know from a lot of polling that what people feel is, oh, hold on, that's my dog. They feel like we want a lot of spending. Even if you say you're small government, you actually want a lot of spending and you don't want to raise taxes. Even if you're, quote unquote, tax and spend liberal, you actually don't like taxes. You like taxes on other people, but you don't want to pay taxes. So nobody really wants to do any of these things, which is why the political pressure is against fiscal responsibility. However, the issue of fiscal responsibility polls reasonably well. So the big problem here is the inconsistency and the sort of hypocrisy of like, oh yeah, I don't want to add to the debt, but I want that spending program and I want you to cut my taxes. And so I'm going to show you that one of the tools I was talking about, just because I do think they're kind of interesting on it. Let me see if I can, because that's exactly why we built these tools. So I wanted to do something that allowed people to learn those issues in a way that was more inviting. So there's one more or less where, can you guys see it?
Yes.
Okay, so this is basically a quiz, but it's an interactive quiz of what do you think we should spend the money on? So if the government, and I did it per person because I think trillions means nothing to people, right? So the government spends $13,000, $13,550 per person. Should we spend more or less? And there's no right or wrong answers. It's just preferences. $2,000 on defense, $80 on foreign aid. And it just kind of takes you through a breakout of these dollars in a way that's easier for you to identify with. So play around with these. You guys will tell me whether it's a good way to engage people at all. I'll just show you what the other tools are. There's a personality quiz. It's like a BuzzFeed thing for the budget because those are very popular. All the young people in my office told me. Boomers versus Zoomers looks at the generational allocation of money, how we spend it on seniors versus kids, because you can tell that's something I am really passionate about and think we have an upside down budget. Just a basic quiz. And then these two, which are really interesting, how much should we be doing in resources and how do you think we should pay for it? Just to hit this one for a second, this shows you how much it says, how much do you think we should pay from borrowing versus taxes for the overall budget? And so you can pick, and then you can look at the different kinds of taxes, how you would do them. And you can look at how progressive or regressive you think a tax code should be. These take a little bit more time to think about. And then it compares what you come up with what most people who look at this are. And so the other reason we did these tools is I really wanted to make it accessible enough to people that they felt that they could weigh in and see whether crowdsourcing is a good idea on the budget or a really terrible idea. Because it may be that people spend money on things that are completely not realistic, like underinvest in all the public investments or the infrastructure of the government, like the judicial system. You need that. You need civilian pensions, things like that. Anyhow, that's the tools. You guys can look at them all you want. Anyhow, to answer your question, basically, I think what is really popular with voters is a lot of spending, not a lot of taxes, and pretending that you're dealing with the debt in a responsible way, even though you're not. And that's why this issue is so hard. It is a political loser. And I feel really bad because there are a bunch of members of Congress who really care about it. And I'll work with them a lot. And if they go out and say a bunch of the things that we're talking about, I'm almost always do it in a bipartisan way because I'm so committed to trying to create legislation that's more durable and will last and isn't kind of a pendulum back and forth. But if they go out and say these things, it is more likely than not that they will get punished at the voting booth for it. And so the question is are there ways to make this issue more popular with the public? I've seen that there are, and it comes from when you have people at the top making it a national priority, and then when you have strange bedfellows. So there have been periods we had politicians from both parties saying, this really is a problem. It's an issue of national security. It's an economic threat. We disagree on how to fix it, but we acknowledge we need to. that makes the issue much more popular with the country. It used to be an era where people talked about shared sacrifice a lot more than now. And that is was something that made people more willing to kind of do the hard choices of spending and taxes. But the other option, then kind of the public education coming from the top of politicians, is budget rules. We don't have any budget rules right now which limit how much you can borrow. So there's a lot of interest in saying, could we change the budget process so it actually didn't let you borrow infinity every year? And when your debt got too high, you'd start to think about ways to bring it back down. And so maybe you'll see some progress in different budget rules. But right now, it's a free-for-all with two parties that are absolutely warring at each other. And the big casualty in all of that is fiscal responsibility. Caroline.
Hey, I'm Caroline. I'm from CQ Recall. I cover immigration. You mentioned consumption spending versus investment spending. Could you talk a little bit about what those things are, what the differences are, some examples of each, and how to kind of discern consumption spending versus investment spending?
That's a great question, because the answer from politicians will be investment spending is anything they like, right? So I need this because it's agricultural investment, because it's investment in, I don't know, pick anything like this defense investment, a lot of things that are their favorite programs. But the real distinction is investment is something that, because of what you're doing, it increases productivity and therefore returns the economy. Not meaning it pays for itself, because by the way, you guys, basically nothing pays for itself. If someone's telling you they have a tax cut that's going to pay for yourself, it is almost surely a lie. And if someone tells you they have a spending program that's going to pay for itself, it is almost surely a lie. Many of those will grow the economy. But in order for something to grow the economy enough to pay for itself, or enough revenues come back into the treasury, it has to grow the economy about $8. Because that's about 20% is tax, and there's a lot of loss in different pieces in the economic kind of feedback of that. So almost nothing pays for itself. Maybe one thing right now, which is in discussion, which is called the tax gap, which are there ways to make sure that people who aren't paying current taxes that are owed are paying them, and better enforcement at the IRS and more reporting requirements would probably increase those returns. But that's probably the only policy I can think of that pays for itself. So investment doesn't mean that, but investment means it would have positive returns to the overall economy. And so there are a lot of things that are investments that are, the main investments are going to be infrastructure, human capital, education, and basic research and development. So there are things like defense that are part consumption and part investment. Now, I think there's also, it's important to think about a new category that isn't called investment as much, but is probably precautionary investment almost. And I would say like certain kinds of defense, and really importantly, climate, that there are a lot of things that you could spend money on that will avert so many costs in the future that you might evaluate them differently. But I think it's really important. So it's not the only thing that matters. A lot of consumption matters. A lot of kind of welfare programs might not be investments as much as consumption, but you still would might want to do them. I think you would want to do them. So there's a lot of things that are, investment isn't the only criteria that matters, investment versus consumption, but you want to, I think, have the real distinction of, is this a consumption program, an investment program, or maybe this new thing that I just made up on the spot. So I have to think about it, but this precautionary investment area. And in terms of numbers, our federal budget right now is about 86% consumption and 14% investment. Last time I ran through the numbers, that may have changed, but probably not massively.
Thank you.
Maya, I was hoping you could talk us through the Social Security, the long-term trends in Social Security, and also give the fellows a sense of what happened last time that Congress did have to change the programming. That was back in the 80s with the Greenspan Commission. Is that right?
1983, yeah.
I mean, could you tell? I'm just curious, how long will Congress wait until they do something on this? I mean, are they gonna pull something together, in 2031, or is it possible that they'll do something ahead of time? And what happened last time that they avoided the crisis until the last minute?
So Congress seems intent on waiting till the longest possible for any of these things. I mean, we should have made the changes to Social Security already, because this huge baby boom, as they move into retirement, there's a political promise not to have changes that would affect current retirees. That may have to change, but only, I think, for really financially comfortable retirees. I can't imagine there'd ever be support for changing benefits for people who actually are really depending on the program and are in or near retirement. But that means all these baby boomers kind of escaped having to be part of the solution, even though they are the ones who were there making the policies when what we did was borrow money out of the Social Security trust funds to finance the rest of the government. Let me give another minute on that because it's a complicated one. But the way Social Security works is it's a pay-as-you-go program. Our taxes today pay for our current beneficiaries today. So I'm paying in taxes, it's going to benefits for my dad. But there was a long period where we were pre-funding the program, paying more in taxes than we're going out in benefits because we knew the baby boomers were going to retire and need more. We'd have to have more money. Those dollars were deposited in trust funds. The trust funds wisely invest in government debt, treasuries. But it happens that's also how you finance government deficits. So by buying the debt, that meant you didn't have to sell that on the open markets, and it went to finance all the other parts of the government: defense, environment, education. Now we're repaying those trust funds. It's coming due, but there's actually no way to repay it. The money wasn't saved. And so it ends up being a huge burden on the rest of the budget. There'll be trillions that have to be repaid. And so those baby boomers paid less in taxes while they were working because they were using the Social Security money. And so they didn't have to pay as much in other taxes. And now they're collecting the benefits, and somebody else's taxes will go up. So it's a bit of a generational screw you. I mean, it was like, it really shifted the burden in a way that many would see as not particularly fair. So we've known about this. We haven't made changes. What happened in 1983 is they did wait till the last minute, and they didn't basically make the changes to the program until it was about to not be able to pay benefits. And that's kind of the way I see Congress as making tough choices these days, waiting till literally there is not a second to spare. And sometimes going beyond that because we shut down the government way too regularly, and there's absolutely no reason that should be happening. So the commission in 1983, it actually failed. Then they came out second try and basically put in a bunch of policies, same things we should do this time: lifted the payroll tax cap and rate, changed the retirement age. Though they did something neat, which was they put the retirement age increase from 65 to 67 in so slowly. It didn't start for probably a decade. And then it only went up 2 months every year. So basically nobody noticed. And that's one of the tricks I think there are on getting politicians in the country to actually do hard things. Phase them in really slowly, maybe start them in a couple of years so the politicians who voted for it aren't getting punished right away. But everybody knows you have to do those things. And everybody knows we have to do these things for Social Security as soon as possible, but they're forcing their hand to do it kind of makes them more likely to adopt it. So, Chris, did that answer your question?
Yeah, and what will happen? The Medicare trust fund exhausts earlier, in like 5 years or so. What will happen? I mean, play out the next 5 years for me. What's going to happen? What's going to happen?
That one's, it's less clear. It's less clear what will happen and how to fix it. Medicare is much more complicated, but it will be ugly because what will happen is they will reduce the payments they're paying to lots of doctors and people who participate in the Medicare programs to the providers. And then a lot of them are going to stop providing benefits. So what it's going to do is put a huge squeeze on the program. I think they'll also end up increasing premiums for the well-off. So they'll make it more progressive than it currently is. And there's a bunch of changes to how overall healthcare payments are delivered, how the delivery system works that could help control costs. But if they wait to the last minute, there'll be much less savings accrued than if you'd started right now. So I think what it'll end up doing is it'll be a little, rationing is such a trigger word, but it will be it will put pressure on the providers, and you will see less availability of the services in Medicare. So the interesting things about trust funds is it has these dedicated revenue sources, which mean when they're headed towards insolvency. But it's also interesting because dollars are fungible, and really we should be thinking about the federal budget, the whole, that was me making a budget pie, but the whole federal budget pie of like, what are our most important priorities? How much do you want to spend on Social Security, for Medicare, for education, for the environment, for all those things? One other thing I didn't mention is a huge portion of the federal budget actually goes through the tax code. And we have about $1.5 trillion in targeted tax breaks. They're called tax expenditures. If you ever want to learn about them, the Joint Tax Committee has a great annual report on them. They're fascinating. But these are some of the dumber policies in their structure often, because it gives you a tax break based on your tax rate many times. So if you are getting a tax break and you're richer and you're paying a higher tax, you are getting a bigger tax break for the same policy than somebody who is in a lower tax break. So if you need the break less, you may be getting a bigger break. It's upside down a lot of times. The home mortgage interest deduction is something that subsidizes mortgages for the very well off, and the people who subsidize it are renters, you know. So I always like to thank people when I'm talking to young audiences for subsidizing my house. It doesn't seem like necessarily the right policy. They don't have it anymore, but they used to have one for vacation homes. And I was like, could you imagine some member of Congress going to the floor and saying, what I really want is to create a voucher program where I'm going to send vouchers to everybody who has a vacation home. So a lot of things get put into the tax code that I don't think ever would have made it as transparent spending policies, but they also drive up those costs because of the home mortgage interest deduction, which is incredibly popular. I know because I wrote an op-ed about getting rid of it. And it was the only time I actually got a death threat for an op-ed like that. I shouldn't have published it in Los Angeles. It did not go over well there at all. But I mean, these things are incredibly popular because you pay your taxes and you see the breaks, but people don't realize it's actually driving up the cost of what it should be subsidizing. One of the reasons higher ed is so expensive is because of how we subsidize it. So many of these tax breaks end up actually hurting the affordability of the things that we're trying to make more affordable. So if anybody's ever on this beat and like looking for stories, digging into the different tax breaks and the effects they have, I think is a really rich territory for things that are often against the conventional wisdom and really interesting to learn about.
One more question for me. Who are some of the other analysts and experts from other organizations that you can point these fellows to as being good, honest brokers, even if they're from differing political perspectives? I mean, who are some people that should be in their contact list?
Yeah, so CBO is where you want to start. On the left, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities is excellent resource. They do really good work. On the right, Doug Holtz-Aiken and American Action Forum is really good. Brian Riedel, Manhattan Institute, just excellent work. Gosh, there's gonna be a lot of other people. Concord Coalition is the other group that does the kind of thing we do. So on fiscal stuff. Who else puts out great data? Ben Ritz, who works at PPI, who's just a little bit to the left of center, very moderate on the Democratic side. There's so few nonpartisan groups. Some of the individuals at Brookings and AEI are terrific scholars. I should put together a list, Chris, so that I could actually answer that question not off the cuff. But if you ever call me, I can also give you other names. But Brian Riedel, Doug Holtz-Aiken, Center Budget and Policy Priorities. Those are some of my favorites.
Okay, that's very helpful.
But just read CBO for everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just such a great institution. Gosh, so I don't know the world of journalism too well, but I spent a couple months once filling in on the Washington Post editorial board when their real writer was out on book leave. And so I had the fun I learned a lot about it from those months. But one of the things is when I was searching for articles, things to write about. So if you're ever on the economic beat, my favorite place to go search for ideas was the research departments of the individual Federal Reserve banks. They have
okay.
so much amazing research that comes out of them, and they don't get as much coverage as they should, or they only do in the FT and occasionally the journal, but there's really great stuff there. So that's one idea I'd recommend for people who are trying to think about what to write on economics. The other thing, so that more or less exercise that I showed you, I really like putting dollars in accessible amounts. I don't like simplifying the budget too much. Like if you say, the country's like a household, no, it's not. The country has the ability to tax. Like you don't want to oversimplify this issue, but there are a lot of ways I think you can talk about it that make people understand things better. And so I do think charts, I think the New York Times does a lot of really good budget depiction stuff that we help them with regularly. But this one, another tool, I know there are a lot of tools we're making, but I really like them, is called, Is It Worth It? And basically you just go on, if you Google, is it worth it, CRFB, what comes up is every spending program major, every major tax policy, and every major new initiative that's being discussed. And then you can click so you see the cost of this thing per person, per taxpayer, or per household. And I always think in writing about this, you should talk about the trillions because it means nothing. Like, I don't know, is 2 trillion big? Is 20 trillion big? They're all, they're all massive. You can't get your arms around them. But to bring it down to as the share per person, I think helps contextualize it. So I think that's a really good thing to do. And I would encourage all of you to add context so much of what you write, because nobody understands if you're talking about, oh, this program was going up by $40 billion this year. How much does it normally go up? How much has it grown in the past? What percentage? What share of the budget is it? What share of the economy is? Anything that helps people have a sense, because there's just no scale in the budget. And I think that further alienates people from trying to understand it. I think comparisons of we spend, is why I like more or less, but we spend this much on education versus this much on poverty programs versus this much on international affairs, really helpful, because there's no right or wrong in these questions. They're about our national priorities, but giving citizens a chance to have some sense of what they are so they can think about it for themselves, I think is really important. And especially on something that's so hard to write about or cover, that is a big challenge.